All right. The syllabus is backwards from the book, and I know that, and I realized that yesterday when we were looking for the quiz or whatever. It doesn't really matter what order we do these in. I'm following the syllabus, but don't let that confuse you if you're looking at the book. All of this is in one chapter, including next week's lectures. And then after next week, we have our second exam. So a week, from Tuesday, 2 weeks from Tuesday is the next exam. So it's coming up. Just keep up with the syllabus on that. But right now, I need to talk about memory. And again, this is going to be something that is I put this in here because there's a lot going on right now, a lot of new things, a lot of new discoveries about our brain in particular. That's why we're going to really focus some of our discussion about our own biology on our brain, because we're learning more and more about it. This is another one of those fields where we didn't have the instruments to really study it very well until fairly recently. And we can now watch the brain work in real time. We can do this in various ways, which are becoming less and less intrusive, so that we can really see what's going on in the brain as people respond to different stimuli. There are scientists who have figured out the chemistry of memory, finding a chemical that actually forms memories. And there's a video here, if we have time I might come back to it, that shows how this chemical can be used to erase memories. And then you can relearn, but it can erase a memory. So it brings up a lot of ethical questions too. If we could start erasing our own memories, would you like to go back and erase maybe a very difficult memory, something a tragic event or something? Would you choose to erase that memory? Could it possibly be a treatment for post-traumatic stress syndrome, for instance, or something like that? Would there be therapeutic uses of that technology, or would it be unethical to use that at all? Those are the kinds of questions, again, as we learn more and more about the brain, we're going to have more and more questions like this to face, both in our own lives and as a society. Let's talk a little bit, though, about the brain itself and how memory works, because in a lot of ways, memory is what makes our brain a personal experience, right? We each have a unique memory. We may start off with very similar brains, though, again, our brain development starts before we're born, and so our uniqueness is established before birth. There's a lot of epigenetic impacts on brain development that occur very early in embryonic development, all the way through adolescence. The brain does not stop growing, really, in a way. Now, we're talking about, there's different ways of thinking about that. Whether it's adding neurons is one thing. You actually lose neurons as an adolescent, but you're pruning your brain into effective pathways. So it's during adolescence that the brain becomes more effective, particularly for executive functioning, being able to make good decisions and control impulses and things like that. But that's the whole point of brain development during the adolescent years. You may be losing the number of neurons, but you're gaining connections, and they're becoming more effective. So how well you think really becomes established in those years. And not that you can't learn, if you go through your adolescent years on a drug-induced high, and your brain is not forming those connections, it's not doing what it's supposed to do, that makes it more difficult, but it doesn't make it impossible to continue learning if you can recover from that. But it does definitely delay that development if you're using addictive substances during adolescence. So I know I'm getting way off track here as far as memory goes, but the reason I focus on memory again is because it's easier to relate to. We have both short-term and long-term memory. Short-term memory is the kind of memory if someone were to give you your phone number and you have to remember it long enough to get it in your phone, right? We used to have to remember it as long as we knew the person. Now we just have to remember it long enough to get it in our phone. So, for instance, you might remember your own number if you've given it to somebody often enough, but you probably don't remember a lot of phone numbers anymore. We used to. In fact, there's a lot of people who talk about our memories almost like we're losing the ability to remember things because we've got so many gadgets to help us remember things now. And those are long-term memories that we have less long-term memory in a sense, but in another way it frees us up to use our long-term memory in other ways. So it's just one of those things where it may not be good or bad, and you may decide that it's a bad thing or it's a good thing, but more than anything, it's just a change in the way we are using our minds and our memories as we gain more technology to help us out. Yes?
Isn't your hippocampus in the back here that helps you store memory, or also memory, the hippocampus?
Yes. Yeah, and that's exactly right. And we'll look at some of the feeds. Matter of fact, that's what's in orange here, is that part of the brain, the hippocampus, which does form. It transitions from short-term to long-term memory. So you form a short-term memory, you can hold on to it for a little while. There's a limit to how much you can put in that memory. That's why a phone number is 10 numbers, is 10 digits, because that's how much you can store in short-term memory. If it gets much longer than that, most people have a hard time remembering more than that. But you can remember 10 numbers pretty easily for a short time. And even long-term if it gets put in long-term memory. But not every memory you have gets put into long-term memory in terms of very incidental things. But almost all of your experiences that are longer than just remembering a number do get stored in long-term memory. And there's a lot of interesting questions about whether those memories are there forever or whether they can be lost. But one thing we have learned is that long-term memories are re-circuited, rewired every time you remember them, which is interesting because that means they can be altered a little bit each time you remember them. It's like making a copy of something, and eventually maybe a mistake gets copied and then another mistake. Over time, we tend to remember things from our distant past more emotionally than in details, if that makes sense, right? We remember the emotions involved more than the details, and we tend to skew those memories then of the details towards those emotional memories. So there's a lot of things we can talk about with memory. Now that's not across the board. Everybody, like anything else, there's a range of talents here. And I call them talents because they really are. It's not a better or worse. Some people that remember more detail, some people that remember more context, and so on. If you hear people say they have a photographic memory, they're better at remembering detail. A truly photographic memory is not real. But was there a TV show, wasn't there, about somebody who had a photographic memory? Well, if you really had a photographic memory and remembered everything, that would probably become pretty overwhelming pretty quickly, right? Because I don't need to remember, literally remember every time I walk down the hallway, every other time I've walked down that hallway. It doesn't need to flood back into my memory. Who did I see on Tuesday? Who did I see a year ago? Right? I mean, it would be too much. Now, those memories may be in there somewhere, and there are people, certainly people have better talents than others at that. But anyway, we'll leave that at that for a little bit. All of this is based on the structure of the brain, and again, it's probably, the word neuron shouldn't be, you've heard that, we know what neurons are. They're a unique type of cell in the body, and they're very good at being connected and creating patterns that are then remembered as memory. One thing I do want to start, we started with consciousness on Tuesday. We're going to continue this again in next week's lab as well as this week's lab and start thinking about how these memories actually reflect reality in a sense. Because what you're doing is you're taking patterns of light or touch or sound waves, that's information, and you're putting that into a circuitry of sorts, a connection between different neurons that can recreate that pattern for you when you remember it. And so you remember it as you experience it, but we need to think about what it actually is. As I look out into the room at all of you, the only thing that my brain is actually getting is the light being reflected from your faces and the chairs and all the other objects in the room. If I listen, I'm hearing the sound waves that are reverberating through the room or traveling from, like my voice, towards you. Those waves are causing a vibration in the bones of your inner ear, which is turned into an electrical signal sent to the brain, interpreted by the brain, and then recreated into a memory. It's a very reliable process, but if you remember, and from the first test, you watched that video by David Deutsch, and he brings that up about, have we ever actually seen? This is a nice picture. And when we see that, or when we hear someone's voice, what is it that we're actually experiencing? So when we get down to the level of neurons, and we're simply looking at which neurons fire, which connections are excited, those patterns are what are turned into our memories, or what are stored as our memories, those patterns of neuronal connections. And they're both electrical, but they're mostly chemical. And they're chemicals that control the strength of the signal and the pathway of those signals, the timing of those signals between neurons. And that's really fundamentally how the brain is working. We also know that some interesting facts about our brain that do sort of relate to our evolutionary psychology again, and that is that we learn about our world through imagery. Again, whether that's through visual or touch or sound, our brain stores that information more as an image than as, just binary information or some way a computer might do it. That's why we really can learn better through metaphor in many cases than other ways of learning. We like to compare. This is like this, and that's how we learn, because that's how the brain can match patterns. This pattern is like this pattern. There's similarities there that can be remembered or can be associated, and it's through those ways that we learn. Now, that makes us, if we think about our language, right? Language evokes imagery. It evokes an experience or something that we formed in our mind. If I use the word elephant, you sort of get a picture of an elephant in your mind, right? However that image has been formed, right? It might be an Indian elephant or an African elephant, or it might be a mastodon. I don't know what comes into your mind. But you get this image of an elephant. You're not thinking about its mass and shape. The details don't pop into your mind. It's an image that pops into your mind. So we're very good at seeing images. Very good at it. In fact, we're so good at seeing images that we see them where there aren't any, oftentimes. We look at the moon and we see a face. We look at the clouds and we see all kinds of shapes. Right? We could look at this ceiling and look at the patterns in these tiles. And probably if you looked at them long enough, you could find a few faces in those. We're pretty good at finding faces, even when they aren't really there. And again, the evolutionary psychology behind that is the ability to recognize each other. We are very good at seeing very subtle changes in somebody's facial expressions, or hearing very subtle changes in somebody's tone and mood and expression, and what we emphasize. Moving my hands around, right? I mean, that conveys information. And there really isn't another species that's as good at it as we are. What makes dogs sort of interesting is they're also very good at picking up facial expressions. Unusually good. But maybe that's why, I don't say maybe, but that's a big part of why they've become so utilized as animals that we can work with and then keep as pets and so on. Because they really can see us and know, hey, you're kind of stressed out. And some dogs would get stressed out if you're stressed out, and some dogs would be more, everyone's had a dog that sort of knows about that, right? I've had dogs that run the gamut. Some dogs see you and they can tell you're stressed out, and they'll come and they'll sit on your lap and they'll be all comforting. Another dog I had one time would see you're stressed out and get all stressed out himself. And it's like, come on, I don't need to deal with your stress right now too. But those are somewhat unique abilities. Now, what I want to do for a little while is look at some of the issues that come up with that teach us about the brain and our own brain when we look at actually some breakdowns, either through injury or disease or whatever, in how the brain works. This picture at the top is Oliver Sacks. He's written a number of books. He's a psychologist, but he's written a number of books about the brain, one of which, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. There's a bunch of case studies of people whose brains have been injured or in some way impaired, and there's a number of these things. I won't go through all of them, but literally there are situations where people lose the ability to recognize faces. So even loved ones, they can't recognize their spouse or their children. Otherwise, they function quite normally, but in that one area. So it's interesting how specific brain injuries can be. Musicophilia is another one about what's a process called synesthesia, because there are people who can hear a note of music and associate that with a color, for instance. And it's just as stark as if you were to see the color. You hear a note and your brain processes blue. Those kinds of things. That's called synesthesia. If you've seen the movie Awakenings, one of Robin Williams' movies, so it may have been popped back up recently. But it was based on a true story of a mental hospital where a lot of people were suffering from various mental illnesses, and they stumbled upon an interesting effect of a neurotransmitter. The neurotransmitters are those chemicals that can carry signals through the brain, and one of them is called dopamine. Dopamine is it has many purposes, but it's the one that you get when you run or you exercise. You get what's called a runner's high. It's because you're getting extra dopamine in the brain. Oftentimes drugs will stimulate dopamine to an unnatural level so that your brain then can't come back down and get back to normal, and then you become addicted. Because dopamine makes you feel good, makes you happy, but also makes your brain work more effectively. So they were giving patients who were catatonic, essentially, not really being able to function at a high level. They gave them dopamine and they woke up. They functioned very well. Now, it didn't last, but it was a very interesting experience, almost a flowers for Algernon type of experience, which is probably still a short story most of you read in middle school. And then we can think about things like, what are hallucinations? And, they may seem as real as anything else. It's an interesting one to me, too, as we go forward and integrate our discussions about our own biology with technology. There are now virtual reality games that have gotten better, where you put the helmet on and it replaces all of your visual and auditory stimuli with whatever the game is, and it makes it almost as if you're really there. Now, we still don't have, you're still sitting down, you're not actually moving, so there's some confusion in the brain there. That caused some problems with this for a while because people were getting motion sickness playing these virtual reality games, because the brain was saying, wait a minute, this stimuli is telling me that we're running away from a tank, but these other stimuli, my proprioception, basically what your inner ear tells you whether you're moving or not and whether you're standing upright or lying down, it's telling us something completely different. I'm confused. And it was really causing some issues, but they've worked most of that out now. Apparently there's a new technology that can overcome some of that. But eventually there's even the idea that because we know how we know the chemistry of memory and so forth, you could go into your brain and basically put a memory in there, and it would be as if you had actually experienced that. I mean, no different biochemically than if you had actually experienced it. And you would remember it as strongly as if it had actually happened. Kind of reminds us of alien abductions and things like that. Yes?
Isn't that somewhat like hypnosis? And how can we ever find the very specific chemicals that would control each specific memory?
Well, there's a video on here, and again, if I don't have time to show it to you, I encourage you to click on it on the first slide about just that. It was in a NOVA episode, the chemical that forms memories and can be used to form and erase memories, those kinds of things. Now, was it hypnosis you said, or hallucinations?
Yeah.
Hypnosis, yeah. Hypnosis is a little bit of a different case, because as I mentioned before, you may have a lot of memory that you don't pull up easily, that you sort of lost the tags to, because it's like a computer memory almost. A lot of the way we remember things is remembering a tag to say, okay, here's where the memory is. And you do tag memories and make some of them easier to get and so forth. This is why associations tend to help. Like if you make a study guide and you put pictures along with the phrases you're trying to, or the terms you're trying to remember, then your brain has two things that they can associate, and it's easier to pull those up because there's a tag there, mnemonics and things like that. We'll talk a little bit about memory palaces in the next slide, and I'll come back to that. So hypnosis purports to be able to unlock these hidden memories by relaxing your consciousness enough to bring up memories that otherwise are either blocked a little bit or just sort of buried a little bit. Now that, whether that's actually happening or not is, again, I'm not going to say scientifically whether that's 100% accurate, but that's the idea, that in a hypnotic state, it's really just a state of relaxation where your brain can access information. Now, the problem is, as I've just mentioned, there are memories that can be false memories. We're very susceptible to false memory. And these can be placed in our brain either through, again, we won't say dreaming or hallucination or whatever, that then gets confused with reality, but by suggestion. Right? It's been shown many, many times that people can have a memory simply because somebody sort of suggested something to somebody, and over time, again, as you re-remember that over and over and over again, even though it never really happened, by re-remembering it, it becomes cemented as if it's a real memory. And most of us have some of this stuff. Again, I'm not talking about, I mean, brainwashing is an extreme of this, but we all have a little bit of it, or some extent of this. And we're somewhat aware of that sometimes, and sometimes we're not very well aware of that. And it's become a big issue in court cases, because eyewitnesses can swear they saw something that can be proven that they never did. I mean, that it would be impossible for them to actually have that memory, but they swear that, I mean, as strongly as their conviction can, that they saw a certain thing. So how reliable is eyewitness testimony? It's something we rely upon quite a bit. But if it can be manipulated through propaganda and other things, or even just illness, that's a big question. So I always use alien abduction as an example, because there are people who strongly believe those memories of those events, and to say that they're extremely unlikely is being kind. So I'll I'll leave it at that. I mean, again, I'm not going to say anything's impossible, but the number of people making these claims and how similar they tend to be, it sort of. Again, this is in common sort of folklore, and so it's somewhat easy to create those kinds of memories. I also like to explore optical illusions and magic, and this is again what we'll do next week in lab. The consciousness one talked about magic and how easy it is for us to be fooled, and literally our senses are easily fooled, very easily fooled. And we swear we saw something we didn't see. And that's because the brain fills in what it expects to see. This is one of those things I sort of laugh at my mother a little bit with my kids. She was losing her hearing a little bit, and they would say things to her, and she would hear something completely different. And she was sure that she heard what she heard. And I'm listening to the conversations and thinking, okay, that's not what she said. I'm sure it happens to me too, right? My hearing is not so great, and so I know there are times where my daughter says something to me and I think I hear one thing, so I try to always ask for her to repeat herself. But anyway, it happens, right? I mean, your brain is going to automatically fill in what you expect, either what you expect to hear, what you expect to see, and so if you can sort of get the brain expecting something, you can trick it very easily, and magicians take advantage of that quite often. So we'll look at optical illusions and magic and those kinds of things, but I also want to think about one of the reasons we have this susceptibility is that we also have an imagination, and the advantages of an imagination are worth the costs of being tricked, right? I mean, having an imagination is what allows us, in many ways, to solve problems that are unique, that are new, that aren't following a pattern that we're used to. I've talked about how good we are at recognizing patterns. Well, when you're in a situation where it violates the patterns, you have to be able to get outside of that. You have to be able to use imagination. So having a good imagination evolutionarily is worth being susceptible to being tricked. And they sort of go somewhat hand in hand, right? We're willing to suspend our disbelief. That's what we do when we watch magic. We're willing to say, okay, I know that this really is just a trick, but I'm willing to believe what I see because it's fun. Now we're willing to do that in movies, We have to suspend a lot of disbelief to have fun at the movies, right? Because they're so inaccurate sometimes in the way things would actually happen. But that's actually an ability that helps us. And then perspective. Because perspective, I think, is a very interesting topic as we talk about consciousness and memory. Because if we could experience the same things and remember it quite differently based on our different perspectives. Okay, we would focus on different aspects of the memory, perhaps. Someone more analytical might focus on a memory differently than somebody who's more emotional. They would be the same events, and they would essentially be the same memories, but they would come up somewhat differently based on perspective. All right, if you have a little bit more detached perspective or a little more personal perspective, you're going to reflect on things and remember things a little bit differently. Again, there are links here, I think, to all three of these images that you can follow to follow. We'll look more closely at things like this drawing on the bottom, the butterfly that's appearing to hover over the sidewalk, which is actually just a drawing on the sidewalk. It's very interesting, this artist, Julian Beaver. I always need to make sure I get that name right. And because if you look at this, if you step back from it, it looks like it's three-dimensional. But if you walk up to it, you'll notice that it's actually stretched out. So as an artist, he's realized how the brain is going to adjust what you see to match expectations. So by drawing it really extended, if you look at it from the right angle, it looks three-dimensional because your brain has to sort of bring it up to fit it into your expectations. And again, artists have been doing this for a long time, long before we really understood how this worked in the brain. It's easy for artists to take advantage of things like the shadow and the distortions that lead to certain, misinterpretations of actually what you're seeing that look more real than what they really are. All right, here's a few other links about memory. I mentioned mnemonics. As students, that's probably a familiar term. You can use them to help you remember things for a test and that kind of thing. They're really helpful. There is a competition every year, a world competition of people testing their memories. And it involves things like remembering the order of cards in a deck of cards. Right? If you took a deck of cards that were shuffled and you laid them down one at a time and then flipped it over, could you remember the cards in order? That seems like quite a trick, right? That's pretty difficult to do. People with these competitions can remember 3 and 4 decks of cards at a time. The way they do it is what's called a memory palace. So this diagram on the bottom. And there's a book written about this, again, that might be worth looking up, by somebody who was just a journalist. He didn't have any unusual memory to going in, but he went in and trained for a year and ended up winning one of these competitions. And so the argument is we can all do this if we choose to. If we really worked at it, we could train our memories as well as these competitors. But the cost might be being able to have a regular job, right? Because you're spending all your time trying to remember these tricks and practice those tricks. It takes a lot of work. But for most of us, we've given up a lot of our memories to our devices. Yes?
Excuse me, Doctor. You said the book was Memory Palace?
No, the trick is called the Memory Palace. The book, I'm going to have to think about what the actual book title is. I wish I could remember better. I ought to put it in here. But
Okay.
I can picture the cover in my brain, but that's as far as I can get right now. I might come up with the title in a second. Because that's something I always did. I never did well with mnemonics. But I could almost get a picture of my notes and get that image in my head, almost like a JPEG, and then find where I needed the information. It just worked better for me. Everybody has different strategies that work. And mnemonics always just confuse me. It's like, well, now you're giving me a second thing to remember. Now I have to remember this and that, and somehow pull them together. But for a lot of people, that makes it a lot easier. So the idea of a memory palace is, for instance, if you have a lot of things that you have to remember in sequence, you can think about a familiar place. Like if you've been to the Museum of Fine Arts really often, And so you know when you walk into the museum that you see this statue on your right, and then you go through this doorway and there's this painting here. And you can remember these things in your spatial environment. What you do in the memory palace is you say, okay, when I walk in, the statue on the right, that's the ace of spades. The door, the way that I go through next, that's the two of clubs. And you associate every card with something in that familiar place. When you come back and have to remember the cards in order, then you remember, okay, ace of spades, two of clubs, and you got it. Okay? And so these people practice this kind of thing over and over and over and over again. They build up memory palaces, right? You might go to the museum and just go over and over and over again and literally memorize where all the paintings are so that you can use it as a tool. And that is a decent, I mean, we can all do some of this. I mean, they're mnemonics themselves are sort of an example of this. I'm not particularly good at detail memory. I'm better at contextual memory myself. And that's probably one reason I'm a historical scientist rather than a laboratory scientist. You know, but anyway, those are preferences. There's a lot of evidence growing that practicing this kind of talent, though, is really good for the brain. And not just practicing memory games, but crossword puzzles, Sudoku, problem-solving games. They can help you keep your brain functioning normally farther. You know, a lot of us, we tend to get to a point in our life where we're like, okay, school's over. I don't have to go through that anymore. I know what I need to know, my job, and that's good. And that's fine until you start getting into my age and your brain starts getting a little bit fuzzy. At that point, it helps to keep learning something new all the time. And that keeps the brain healthy. And it actually can forestall things like Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. Keeping your brain active. It's not a muscle, but it's like a muscle in that respect. If you're not using it, it's going to get fuzzy. It's going to get weaker. And so, you know, I mean, I happen to enjoy crossword puzzles and things like that. So if I have a few minutes, like I'm going to have to catch a flight after this course today, or after lab today, so I'm going to take a crossword puzzle, right, to do on the flight. Because I like doing that. Anyway, so that's just an FYI. The other interesting thing up here, I don't know if you recognize the Rain Man. Have you seen the movie Rain Man? It's based on a real person. Again, based on a real person. It's this guy. Now, he doesn't look like Dustin Hoffman, but that's who the character was based on. He is what is called a savant, but he has autism. And essentially, the autism makes it impossible for him to hold a job and to function as we would normally consider a normally functioning person. But he has some remarkably amazing abilities that, for instance, you could tell him, your birthday, and he'll tell you exactly what day of the week it was, because he can just pulls it out of memory. He can do mathematics in his brain that are just astounding. And in the movie, it was like, you know, someone dropped a box of toothpicks, and he said how many there were. Right? He counted them all. Anyway. So this is called a savant because they have a seemingly just beyond normal ability, genius level abilities in one or a few areas, and other areas where they are not as functional. A lot of savants are musical savants. They can hear a song one time and play it perfectly. He also can do some of that. He's read just tons of books and can cite almost everything he's read from memory, like a perfect memory. But he can't manage his money or do a lot of the other things that would be required of a normal person. Now, the person on the right, claims to be a functioning savant, somebody who has savant abilities, but is also able to function normally without a level of autism that would prevent that. Now, he's controversial because some people claim he's using tricks like the memory palace to look like a savant when he's really not. But that whole question is interesting because we each have different abilities, right? There's a guy called the math magician. You could look him up. He's amazing. He can multiply 4-digit numbers in his head faster than you could do it on a calculator. Now, he's not a savant, he's just learned how to do this. He can give you the technique. So it's more like this memory palace. And it brings up the fact that oftentimes it's something we think about, what is the brain capable of? There was a movie Lucy recently.
Oh, yes.
Right?
I just watched it.
Yeah, so the idea is if we could get this myth that we've had forever that we only use 10% of our brain, that's not exactly true. We only can, well, it's better than that now, but what we basically can do is look at the brain and see about 10% of what's going on at one time. But a lot's going on in the background, a lot's going on behind the scenes, so to speak. We're using most of our brain, not all the time, but throughout our lives at some point. But anyway, based on this sort of old myth that we're only using 10%, the question is, if we could use all of it, just how smart would we be? And if you look at these savants, you're thinking, well, we could do all these things, right? We could have perfect memory, we could have perfect musical ability, we could have perfect, this computer-like mathematics ability. If we could use all our brain, we would. Because you can see it's possible. Here's a brain that does that, and here's a brain that does this, and here's a brain that does that. So brains can do these things. If we could use the whole brain, we could potentially be a lot better. Now, in the movie Lucy, it goes pretty far to extremes. She becomes basically able to manipulate quantum attributes of not only her own body but her surroundings and so on, which is probably quite silly. But anyway, yes?
What was the black stuff that she turned into?
What was what?
What was the black stuff that she turned into?
I still can't hear you. Because again, my hearing
Black
is
stuff that Lucy turned into.
Oh, that she turned to in the end?
Yeah.
That's an artist's interpretation of what a basic information on the molecular level might look like. What I'm saying is when I said she could manipulate quantum attributes, and we'll talk about quantum mechanics a little bit later, and especially we'll come back to some other characters in fiction that are similar. The idea is you're just information. Remember as she started breaking down in the airplane into like pixels, and then she had to use her mental control to pull herself back together? The idea was that as she became more and more aware of her own body, it became just information. Everything is just information. And so she could control the attributes of her cells and the molecules that make up her cells to keep them intact, but she didn't have to. So eventually she could become just information, just like quantum mechanics says everything is, and basically disappear, but still, be in all the molecules around us or whatever, and still remain conscious. So again, that's where it gets a little bit silly, and there really was a lot of modern ideas in there that were sort of just all thrown together in this kind of silly way to make that. It was a fun movie. Again, but yeah, it was interesting, and basically that's sort of the premise. And I don't know how obvious that was, but to science fiction fans or somebody, it might have been obvious that the whole premise of the movie was if we could use all of our brain's abilities, we could think like a quantum computer, and we would have controls of the quantum attributes of our own molecules, and therefore become essentially omnipotent in our control of our surroundings and ourselves. And if we could maintain consciousness through all of that, we'd be able to transcend reality in a sense. This is sort of along the lines. We're starting to build this in our discussions now. I keep talking about reality. That movie was a lot about reality, right? And bringing reality down to the level of information. So we'll come back to this. We'll come back to this over and over again. All right, I think I've covered everything on that slide. Let me see if I have another one. Okay, so this brings us to, I think this is my last slide. And again, there's a lot of links in here that I haven't taken the time to show. And I might show one or two of them next week in lab. But if you go through and watch some of these, they're very interesting. But I wanted to finish with this one because there are comparisons between our brain and a computer. We always try to think about our brain in those terms. For instance, I will show a video next week of a woman who had a stroke, and she talks about the two sides of the brain. one working like a serial processor, one working like a parallel processor. Well, what that refers to is in computers, a serial processor does one line of reasoning at a time, right? So, and that's really all a single computer can do. A single computer has ones and zeros, and so it solves a problem that way. But you can hook computers together and make them function parallel to each other, and that becomes a parallel processor. The brain is much more like a parallel processor. You're processing a lot of information at one time, and this is what makes the brain more powerful than a computer. Right now, even the most powerful supercomputer cannot do all the calculations that a human brain can do. It's just that the calculations that we're doing are not something we've been able to have a computer do. The calculations a computer does is something that we somewhat struggle with. A computer can do mathematical equations very, very quickly, where we have to really train ourselves and concentrate on those. But again, we can recognize faces, like that. And we can tell whether somebody's mood changed in an instant. You said the wrong, oops, I said the wrong thing. Right? I mean, that's a lot of information, actually. A lot. For me to just look out into this room and spatially be able to orient everything in the room, that's a lot of information. And again, I'm constantly darting my eyes around to try to keep up with all of that and processing it constantly. It's changing. It's constantly changing. So our brains are doing a lot more than a computer does on a lot of levels. But computers are really good at certain things, and we're trying to get computers that could be more like our brains in some ways. Because if we could combine the two things, we'd have a computer that's basically that ultimate savant, where you've got a functioning computer on all levels, but also still with the power to do all the faster calculations and work faster. Now we'll come back to this too. We'll talk a little bit about how close are we to having a computer that can think like a human brain, that can exceed the capacity of the human brain. We may not be that far away. We talk about artificial intelligence. We're talking about when a computer might get to the point where it's truly, I mean, we already have artificial intelligence, computers that are doing things that we would describe as intelligence, learning, for instance, from its own mistakes, making inferences from patterns, some of the things that we consider intelligent. It's not just straight calculations anymore in a computer, but they still don't do everything we do. If you remember Watson, this was the IBM computer that won Jeopardy. It's an interesting study about how they were able to make the computer able to do that, because when they first started, it lost miserably. It was horrible. Jeopardy is a unique game because it really relies more on metaphor and tricks of language than it does on just absolute memory. Now, a lot of it is trivial. A lot of it is just, okay, do you remember this date, this name, this historical fact? But a lot of it is putting that into a sort of puzzle-like situation where you have to, again, make an association that is somewhat requires metaphor or something like that. Computers are horrible at that. But they were able to train a computer to be good at that. They gave it all the banks of memory it needed, right, which is more massive than any person usually has. So it had all the information on the internet, even though it wasn't connected to the internet. It had all that knowledge in its memory. And then it ran an algorithm that said, this question has these components to it. Let's look for all the possibilities of how these components could be juxtaposed in order to give us an answer, and then calculate the odds of which one is most likely accurate. And again, at first it was horrible. And then they made one unique change. They let it remember its mistakes. And by doing that, it trained itself to get the right answer most of the time and started winning and beat even the best Jeopardy players. So by learning from our mistakes, we have a huge advantage over most computers. Okay, now again, Watson is a prototype, and there may be some more like that. I know I'm running out of time, but just quickly, we can think about how the brain is wired. We might be able to make circuits in computers the same way. This is sort of what the Synapse project is about. It's building computer circuitry similar to the way the brain is built. Quantum computers we'll come back to again. These are computers that can use more than just 1 and 0 in the calculations, but actually states in superposition that could allow the computer to run parallel processes basically in the same computer at the same time. There's some questions whether or not our brain can function like that. And again, in Lucy, they made that assumption that the brain can or does function somewhat like a quantum computer. So we'll come back and talk a little bit about that. And whether or not computers would become aware if they become complex enough. At what point of complexity does a brain become consciously aware? And will a computer become consciously aware if we get to that same level of complexity? It's a question we'll leave open for a little while. We'll come back to that again in lab and a couple other points. So let me get to the quiz in the book. We'll come back to this quiz next week, of course, and this one. So I'm going to get the memory. And here we go. All right. So human memory is a complex brain-wide process. That's true. We can isolate different parts of the brain that are responsible for processing different types of information. We talked about the hippocampus and memory. You've got the occipital lobe and visual, the auditory lobe and sound and so on. I mean, there's different parts of the brain that do flare up under, if you're looking at them under an MRI or something, given certain tasks. But it all ties together with memory, long-term memory, and these things all tie together with our ability to reason and so on. And so memory really is tied to all of that in the long run. All right, there's a Rain Man in all of us. It's one of those questions where you could probably answer either way. And again, I'll go back in this quiz and make sure that no one's penalized for that. We're going to say true, simply because the idea is that these abilities are possible in each of our brains. We all have different talents because we're utilizing different parts of our brains a little bit differently. But potentially, we could all train our brains to do better at different tasks like memory and mathematics and so on. Memories are never lost, we just forget how to find them. That's mostly true. Again, I won't penalize you if you pick false here, but they can be changed, however. So that's why
It's false.
being lost, so I would allow for false as well. This is one of those where I'm almost challenging you along the lines of that consciousness thing to question. This is an assumption most of us make. All my memories are there if I could just find them. Go back in hypnosis. But this is why even hypnosis sometimes, you can't assume that the memory you're pulling up is a real memory. It could be created, it could have been changed or altered over time. Which one do you want to say, true or false?
False.
All right, we'll say false. And I don't know again how that'll be coded, but I'll make sure it doesn't. Okay, what? I thought that was funny. True or false? And synesthesia occurs when the stimulation of one cognitive modality produces a sensation in another cognitive modality. It's a fancy way of saying, it's true, because that's a fancy way of saying that you might stimulate your brain by sound, and your brain also remembers a color or something like that. Or you may see a color and you hear a musical tone. something like that. So that one's definitely true. All right, I'm going to see if it dinged us on, yeah, see?
Number 3.
So we said false there. Anyway, again, I'm not going to penalize you for that. So don't worry about this one. Whatever you get on this one is fine. We decided as a class that it was false, and it's logged in as true. All right. If you didn't get your test on Tuesday, I have them. If you want to hang around, I can give them. I can pass those out.